Hello everyone, I'm Santiago, and today I'm gonna be testing Nioh on the GeForce GTX 1050 Ti. For FPS monitoring, I'll be using Cam. If you want to download this software, there's a link down in the description. And if you enjoy the content and want to support the channel directly, there are Humble and Amazon affiliate links down in the description as well. So Nioh, I'll be doing 1080p, 900p, 720p and 1440p. To skip down at those sections of the video, check the description below. So first I'll show you 1080p using the maximum settings. So 30 frames per second there will be my target, since 60 frames per second is more difficult. And well, on the castle area where it rains and all that kind of stuff, it drops below 30 frames per second in very specific places when it's loading a new area, it seems. So I saw it drop to 26, 27. Away from that, it wasn't too bad. It was over 30 frames per second just fine most of the time. Then I'll show you the lowest settings, which is I turn everything off, but I keep the resolution the same. And in the castle area, I drop below 60 frames per second very often. But it's not too bad, it feels way more fluid than on the max settings option. But then in the more open area, 60 frames per second constant is easier to do. So on some levels you might get drops below 60, on some others it should be fine. I'll talk more about that in a second. But yeah, so far in this open area that I tested, it's set close to 60 frames per second. But then on rainy areas it drops below 60, so keep that in mind. Then on 900p I did the same thing. I tested a tweak configuration to be close to 60 frames per second, and then I just cranked up the settings to the maximum. But on 900p I was able to use medium shadows and dynamic reflections onto the 60 frames per second-ish configuration, which looks a little better. Then at 720p I used the maximum settings, and on the castle I had some rough drops below 60 frames per second, but it was just on very specific places. It wasn't all the time that I was dropping below 60 like crazy. So if you want a more consistent frame rate in those very specific places, just lower shadows and ambient occlusion, that helps out. And then at 1440p, since it was impossible to be even close to 60 frames per second, I used the lowest settings but shadows on medium, so we at least have shadows enabled, and that allowed me to be over 30 frames per second, excepting on some very specific castle areas where it dropped to 27, which was a very sudden moment. If you don't want that single drop to 27, just turn off shadows. But so far it was playing just fine. And now I'm going to talk to you about the options menu and the testing methodology. So this game has an external options menu outside of the game, a launcher. That is the only way to change resolution, so keep that in mind. Inside the game you can only change shadows, frame rate cap, ambient occlusion, camera motion blur and dynamic reflections. So if you want to change the resolution, you have to be outside of the game. So in the launcher we have all the options that I mentioned just now, plus screen resolution and rendering resolution. So on screen resolution is the resolution of the screen, and rendering resolution is the internal rendering resolution of the game. So I'll just suppose that rendering resolution on high means native resolution. So if you're using something like medium or low, it should be lower than the native resolution you chose above. And the options that gave me the biggest hit in the frame rate were pretty much all of them. Shadows and ambient occlusion are the biggest hits so far, so if you lower them you should have the best performance. Dynamic reflections was a smaller hit, but it's still noticeable, and camera motion blur was just annoying to my eyes, but it was also a small hit. So I recommend you just experiment with that. And for some reason, shadows on low run worse than shadows on medium. So I recommend, if you're lowering shadows, use medium shadows or turn them off, because low shadows just runs worse for some reason. It just seems to be a bug. And my testing methodology was first to show you the first level of the game, where there's a castle, it's raining, there are a few enemies on screen, there are particles, all that kind of stuff. For some reason that's what ran the worst for me. And then I went into a bigger area of the game. There is fire, there is water, there are more enemies on screen, there is some foliage. So I decided to test that, and it runs better. So I just show you a small map that has a lot of reflections, rain, particles, and a bigger map that also has particles and many enemies on screen. So I show you the worst case scenario of what I played so far, because I gotta play the entire game before doing a video like this. I don't have enough time, unfortunately. So just keep in mind that in places that rains, there's foliage plus particles, you have the biggest performance hit, like I showed you at the beginning of the video. And this game also needs a texture quality option, which is missing, so people with 2 GB of VRAM can run the game better. And well, not much else to say. The game is capped at 60 frames per second, unlocked frame rates will be nice. And on the CPU side, it seems to just stutter when I'm switching between areas. The CPU sometimes spikes to 100% and then goes down again. So it seems to be just when it's loading new assets in between areas. Other than that, the game ran the same for me on the G4560 and a better CPU like a Ryzen 3 1200. So I wouldn't mind too much about a CPU, it will just make the game more stable when you're going between areas or loading new areas. So yeah guys, that's pretty much it. I hope you keep enjoying the video, thanks for watching and see you next time.
Wait for nothing? Gotta do something. If I jump...
Блин, он труща. Direkt gönderdi olayım.